You want to turn to Daniel chapter 11. I think it's page 950 in most of the Pew Bibles. That is where we're going to be today. Daniel 11 all the way through into just part of Daniel 12. And so we're not going to read that whole thing together, but I am going to walk us through that a bit. Now, at my house right now, in my family, we enjoy Star Wars. We like Star Wars. We are fans of Baby Yoda. I don't know if any of you are fans of Baby Yoda. If you don't know what Baby Yoda is, I'm very sorry. Some of you are like Star Wars. I don't get this either. Just relax. We'll move past it in a moment. I feel like I should say we're not the kind of people that necessarily like go to the movies dressed up or anything like that. I want you to kind of know that this is a healthy place for me, and I'm not some sort of strange person. All right, but we enjoy Star Wars. Now, I remember when I watched Star Wars when I was a child. The first one came out in 1977. I wasn't born until 1979. I remember when I was old enough to understand the movie, and my dad showed me the movie probably on VHS or something like that. And at the very beginning, you know, the kind of opening credits roll through, and it says Episode 4. So the very first Star Wars movie that was made was the fourth movie. It's very confusing. Try and explain that to your 8-year-old. I try. He doesn't get it. All right, but the very first one said Episode 4, and I remember saying to my dad, I'd like to see Episode 1, 2, and 3. And he said, wouldn't we all? They don't exist yet, and that made no sense to me. How can you know where something is headed, but you don't know where it has been? It makes very little sense. Of course, as time goes on, 22 years after the first episode came out, George Lucas unveils a new Star Wars movie, Episode 1. And as that film develops, you're meeting characters that you've already seen in Episode 4, so you know where it's headed. You know that this cute little kid is one day going to be Darth Vader. You know that this young person with teenage angst is going to grow up and become Darth Vader. So you know where it is headed. Sometimes when we know the future, it affects how you deal with something in the present. You might get emotionally attached to it. You might find yourself involved in a story, but you know where it is headed. If you've ever seen a movie and then read the book, or if you've read the book and then gone to see the movie, you know where everything is headed. And you still become emotionally attached and emotionally involved in it, but you have a knowledge of how it all works out. Sometimes we come to parts of Scripture that give us that give us the understanding of where things are headed. A lot of what we're reading in Scripture is in the past. And so when you're reading it, when you're going through the Gospels and you're reading about the life of Jesus, you know where that is all headed, but we still become emotionally invested in the story. We still become caught up in what is going on. In this portion of the book of Daniel, God is revealing important details to Daniel, important details about the future for him, and about what is going to happen to God's people. And in this, God is going to remind Daniel of the great truth that He is faithful. That He is faithful. The book of Daniel consists of a lot of repetition, really designed to drill down this truth. I mean, repetition is what we use to make sure that someone understands something. When I'm speaking with my children at home, I repeat things sometimes over and over and over again because it is important for them to do so that I do not lose my mind, and so that it takes place. What we're trying to get them to understand, they come to understand. This book repeats pictures and descriptions of God's faithfulness over and over. When Daniel and his friends early on refused to eat the food of the king, God is faithful, right? Later, when Daniel is giving the interpretation of the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, God is faithful. When Daniel and his friends refuse to bow down to the image that Nebuchadnezzar sets up, God is faithful. When Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, God is faithful. God is faithful all the time throughout the life of Daniel in these real-time events, in a sense, that we're reading, these narratives. And so now God is saying, I have been faithful in all of this. You need to expect me to be faithful in the future. And I think we need to understand that. God has been faithful in your life. God has been faithful as we read in Scripture. We need to expect God to continue to be faithful. And these truths about the future can help us to live in the present. Understanding and expecting God to be faithful in the future gives us the knowledge, the power even that we need in order to live faithfully in the present. And the book of Daniel teaches us about how we can look ahead so that we can live today. Now, this chapter is really more of where we've been in the past few weeks. We've been dealing with visions. If you go back to chapter 7 and 8, there were these visions of beasts and goats and horns. And in chapter 10, there's this vision of a man. And now chapter 11 is building off of all of that, but it's straightforward. If in those previous passages, God was kind of dealing with people who learn more visually, now He's going to those of us that just prefer a lecture. Those of us that just want to get our notebook out and write down what's going on. That is kind of what we have here in chapter 11. There's no pictures to decipher, no visions to ponder. It's a straightforward approach from this angel. He says, Daniel, here's what's going to happen. Now, he doesn't give names. Names are not given. But nor are there images or symbols. It's kind of like a lecture. He says, here's what's going to happen, falling in line with all of those other chapters. And now for Daniel, as he hears this, it's all ahead for him. This is all what is to come. This is all in the future. Where we stand today, some of it has happened, and some of it, we believe, will happen. We're going to look at really four scenes. Four scenes from this passage, two of which have occurred, two of which will occur. Two that we can look back on historically and see where they've fulfilled. And two where we look ahead and wait in expectation. And in each of these scenes, what I would like to do is offer an observation and a challenge for us. An observation and a challenge. So the first scene is this. It really begins with Daniel's time. There's lots of back and forth in the entire passage. If you were to read through it, it says this king and this king of the south and this king of the north, and they marched. And really, you have to read it through a number of times to make sense of it. I tried to chart it all out. I'd have to go back and redo it. It's hard. This is tough stuff. It can be confusing, but when we take a step back, it becomes a little more clear. I want to read for you just the first 3 verses, starting with verse 2. This is what the angel says to Daniel. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up against all the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Now, some of you love history. You love timelines. You love the rise and the fall of kingdoms. Others of you slept through history class. A lot of drool on your desk. That was pretty much your time in history class. The angel here is giving Daniel a history lesson of the future. He's saying, here is what's going to happen. But for us, these things have happened. We could read this passage side by side, opened up with a history book. And we would see that what Daniel's being told actually happens, which is a wonderful thing to think about. God knows what's going to happen, down to the most minute detail, down to the most specific thing. This is not some sort of charlatan. He's not being so out there that anything could fit. You know, you ever watch those people on TV who are like, someone in here lost someone, or a pet, maybe? Someone lost a pet over here, and your pet loved you, and I'm seeing the letter J. Right? And one of you is going to be like, oh, you're talking about Juju, my pug, or something like that. I mean, stuff like that happens all the time where you can be broad enough that you can hit that target somehow, right? This is no kind of charlatan-esque idea here. It's not so broad that anything could fit. This is specific. This is specific. Daniel, I'm going to try and break down some of this here for us. Just these first 3 verses. We're not going to do this through the whole chapter because it would just become too much. All right, but Daniel talks about 3 Persian kings followed by a 4th Persian king who would be richer than the other 3. We believe these kings are Cambyses and Smerdis and Darius Hystaspes. And then the rich king is Ahasuerus from the book of Esther. And they fit in the historical record. They fit right here. It makes sense. He says, a mighty king who will rise and do what he pleases. This, we believe, is Alexander the Great. He conquers most of the world known at the time, and then he dies suddenly. And if you know your history, you know that Alexander was not able to pass the kingdom down to his sons. The kingdom was taken from his family, and it was divided into 4. which is what we're told here, that a kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. Alexander dies, and the kingdom is dispersed to his four generals. And as the passage continues, it narrates with stunning specificity and accuracy many of the conflicts that arose between these kingdoms that came out of Alexander. And I could continue to narrate this, but some of you who are already starting to fall asleep would. But I will tell you that this is, for me, thoroughly fascinating, and for many of you it is as well. And so when you dig deeper into this, it's not just the history that causes me great joy. It's looking and seeing the clear understanding of God, the clear knowledge, the way in which God is directing history in the way that He said it would happen. There are a couple of resources that I highlighted in your service program that you can go to if you want to look in this in more depth. But through all of these kingdoms, here's the observation that I want to make. Kings and kingdoms come and go. They come and they go. I counted close to 20 kingdoms mentioned in the first 20 verses of chapter 11. They all came and they all went. Some come in with great fanfare, others show up like a blip on the screen. It would be like going back through the presidential history of the United States. Some presidents served 4 years. Some presidents served days. Some presidents served as many as 12 years or even more. They served all sorts of different periods of time, and if we were to look back, they all came and they all went. But while people are living under these kingdoms, they may have felt attacked or oppressed, and they may have felt like this will never end. You've been in places like that. I can remember being in school. And I'm sure there's kids in here that are in school right now, and some of you have been in, hopefully all of you at some point were in school. And sometimes there were years where it seemed like it stretched for eternity. I remember going to 5th grade, and every day in 5th grade felt like it was 1,000 years. 5th grade was a hard year. It was tough. You would look down, you'd do work, you'd look up, it'd been like a minute and a half. You ever have anything like that? Do you remember that? Maybe, and you wake up, it's got to be Friday, it's Tuesday. I mean, that was 5th grade for me. Then 6th grade came, and Miss Newhouse. Miss Newhouse, you would walk into class, pick up your book, sit down, the bell would ring, it was time to go. That's how much fun we had. That's how great the class was. It just moved. Some of you have had experiences like that where life just seems to move quickly. For some, either way, in both of those situations, I can look back and say, it came though and it went. And you may feel as though you're in one of those long periods of time, of suffering, of persecution, of tribulation and trial in your life in some way. It will come, it will go. Kingdoms come and kingdoms go. Every kingdom has a shelf life. And it's very instructive for God's people because it reminds us that we should neither overly fear a king or a kingdom, nor should we overly hope in a king or a kingdom. There have been and continue to be places in this world where Christians suffer, and they suffer under governments and systems that persecute them and that bring charges against them for all sorts of things, from having a Bible to converting to Christianity to sharing your faith. But one thing that they can't do, those kingdoms cannot touch the soul. They will come and they will go. They have a shelf life. And so we don't want to overly fear things that come against us. Sometimes Christians speak with such a fear of what is going on. But we also don't want to overly hope in things. Deliverance and salvation comes from Jesus. It doesn't come from a political party. It doesn't come from a specific candidate. It doesn't come from a political philosophy. We do not want to act as though a man or a woman that we put into office is going to deliver us. That's not fair to them. And it's wildly unhealthy for you. Because it won't happen. Deliverance and salvation comes from Jesus. So the challenge for God's people is that we hope in eternal things. We believe that the kind of change that the world needs doesn't come from something temporary. It doesn't come from something that will come and will go. It doesn't come from something that has a shelf life. It comes from something that is eternal. It comes from something that has changed people's hearts really from the beginning. It comes from the truth of who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, and how that changes our life. That is what changes us. That is what gives us hope. That is what allows for us to look and say, yeah, it's hard now, or it's going to get more difficult, or it's hard for people in other parts of the world. But again, the hope is not in a military deliverance. The hope is in the deliverance that we have through Jesus. The hope is in knowing that He is in control. This moves us into the second scene that we come to, and this is the career of Antiochus Epiphanes. Say that name 5 times fast. It's kind of fun. In his place, we're told in verse 21, in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. This a contemptible person that arises, we can look at with confidence historically and say it's Antiochus Epiphanes. We've talked about this king, if you were here when we worked through chapters 8 and 9. All right, he was a powerful king. He was full of himself. He might sound like someone you know. He believed himself to be a god. He gave himself the nickname Epiphanes, which means manifest as in a god. And the rest of the passage where it talks about him, it talks about how he would consolidate power, how he would wage war against other nations. And again, you can read this side by side with a history book because it all fits together. But in this passage, we read that the king is going to turn his attention towards the people of God. And in this part, the angel begins to reveal one of the main purposes of his message, to prepare God's people for coming persecution. We're told that Antiochus would take out his frustrations on the Jewish people by destroying the temple, by abolishing the sacrificial system. He would send troops in on a peace mission into Jerusalem, and then when they got there, they would just massacre many. It was going to get worse for God's people. He was telling them that persecution would come. And this is an important message for believers, to understand that things can get difficult. Especially in other parts of the world, they know that there is difficulty going hand in hand with their choice to follow after Jesus Christ. We, in this society, we don't deal with that on the same kind of level, but it doesn't mean that at some point we won't. And so we need to understand that that is on the horizon. In verse 32, we see what happens in times of heightened persecution. It says, he, this is the king again, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. The observation we have here is that the enemy always entices rebellion. All right, we're told that 2 things are going to happen during this heightened persecution. Some are going to be seduced with flattery to violate the covenant. They're going to walk away from God because they've been seduced in some way, while others will stand firm. Where will we be? Antiochus seduced some with flattery. He promised God's people if they walked away and worshiped Zeus instead, that he would reward them. He bribed them. We see how firm their faith is because after offering them enough, some of them walk away. He entices them towards rebellion in their heart. He's telling them that you can find fulfillment, you can find hope, and you can find peace somewhere else. That God is not the only place where you can find those things. And so the time that we live in is not that different. Here in the time where we live, maybe a king isn't trying to seduce us to follow after another deity. There's no idol in your neighbor's yard they want you to bow down to. But we do live in a time where we're being enticed towards a kind of rebellion where we look and say, fulfillment can be found elsewhere. Peace can come from something else. Lately, my children have been filling out their Christmas lists, and then they redo it, and redo it, and redo it. And so there's this giant list that they want, which is what we ask for. I don't know why, but we ask for it, and here it all is. And there's this feeling, right? This hope that if I get everything on here, it's going to be great. Life will be perfect. I remember when I was 9 years old, all I wanted was a Tetris watch. It was a watch that you could play Tetris on. I wanted this because I was not enjoying school, and I thought that would make the day go by quicker if I could just play Tetris on my watch. And I remember telling my mom and dad, all I want for Christmas is a Tetris watch. I believe I told them that on December 22nd, but that was when I told it to them. My mom found one. And I got that for Christmas, and it changed my life for like 7 days, right? And after 7 days were over, and I'd gotten as far as I could on that Tetris watch, I set it aside and I moved on to something else. None of those things would bring fulfillment. Maybe it was video games. Maybe it was baseball cards. Maybe it was action figures. Maybe as I got older, it was the right job. Maybe it was a relationship with a girl. Maybe it was good grades. Maybe it was making a sports team. Maybe it was moving up in the corporate ladder or the corporate world. Maybe it was getting your name on a door. Maybe it's getting the car that you want. Maybe it's getting the new car that you want. Maybe it's getting the newer car that you want, or the boat, or the lake house, or having a family and having children and little people running around your house with your face. Maybe it's all of those things that you want. And then you find that each of these things that we think is going to bring fulfillment doesn't. Because the enemy always wants us to think we'll find fulfillment somewhere else. We'll find it somewhere different. And so the challenge for God's people is that we focus on a heavenly thing. We focus on our heavenly King. Because what I'm trying to say is that everything becomes richer, fuller, and more fulfilling when Jesus Christ is at the center of your life. All of those things I mentioned, I don't think any of them are wrong in and of themselves. They're good things. And they become better things when our heart is centered on the greatest thing. When we're focused, when we're committed to our heavenly King, when our life puts Jesus Christ at the center, everything else comes into greater focus. I remember the first time that I saw an HD TV. You can't go back. And then for a period of time, people would say, hey, come over and watch the game. And what would I think in my mind? What kind of TV do they have? I need to be able to see, the blood coming out of their nose. I need to be able to see that long nose hair, because that HD will show that. I feel bad for people who are like the news people. They have it hard now, because it's all right up there. It's hard to go back. When you have Jesus Christ at the center of your life, in a sense, it's like everything else you're now seeing in a higher definition. You're understanding the importance of it. You're understanding where it belongs in life. You have it in the right place. And so God's people are focused on a heavenly King. When we get to the next scene, starting in verse 36, the tone shifts. The tone shifts. And now, whereas before we're looking back and we could read it with a history book open, now we're looking forward. Now we're looking ahead at things that are still to come. And so this scene that starts in verse 36 is of a future evil king to come. And we read very quickly, and the observation that we make is that this future king will act like God. Verse 36 tells us that he shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god and speak astonishing things against the God of gods. This is a picture of the villain. This is a picture of the villain to come. Previous kings fit nicely into historical records, but this one doesn't seem to. And that's why a lot of people believe that he's still to come. We're told that he'll act like a god, that he'll want to be worshipped, he'll say astonishing things. And you might say, well, we've seen that before. There's kings and kingdoms who have done this, and I agree, but they are as a picture of what's to come. And it serves as a warning and a challenge to people, to God's people. We do not worship men, but we worship our heavenly King. Our worship is reserved for God. God's people only worship our heavenly King. So we have to constantly check our mind to make sure that we're reserving worship for God and not for something else. And we've talked about this a bit already, but there's this danger of being enticed towards living for other things rather than for God. And this is a similar kind of danger that we're talking about right now, where we begin to worship something else, where we begin to sacrifice for something else. You might think that you find fulfillment in some things, and so you do stuff for that, but then other times we're willing to sacrifice important parts of our life for other things, thinking again that fulfillment will come. And so you will sacrifice time with your children and with your family, thinking that what you can do for them that's best is to further your career, when really what you're doing is you're now giving worship to a career because you're sacrificing something for it. Now, are there times where you're going to have to work more than other times? Yes. Some of you are accountants. God bless you. All those numbers. Couldn't do it. All right? But there are periods of time that come up in your life and you don't see the light of day for months on end. All right? Just bloodshot. You've been crunching numbers all the time. I get that that happens. But some of us have basically laid our children on the altar and said, to the God of career, I'm going to leave this alone. I'm going to turn this over. We've given worship to something other than, right? Yesterday, big day, right? Michigan-Ohio State game. I want to talk about worship. All right, sometimes when it comes to sports and our sporting events and our sporting teams, all right, we lay it all out there. That becomes the thing that we live for. And this is a reminder to us. Our worship belongs to Jesus. Our worship belongs to Him. So what we want to do is be involved with others in worship, because people who are truly worshiping God won't be swayed and won't be won over easily by something false. If our worship is centered on Jesus, if we're growing closer to Him in our heart and in our mind, then we will not fall away when we're enticed to. Let the beauty and the intricacy and the nature of God, let it drive you to worship. Worship with others. Worship God in a private way. But do that so that when something is coming that tries to steal your worship away, you're still focused on the one that we should be. The final scene that we come to here happens in chapter 12. This is what we would call the final act. And in these verses, we believe Gabriel's telling Daniel about what will happen in the end. And so here's what happens in verses 1 through 3. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book of life. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And in this observation that we have here, it's very clear that trouble's coming. Trouble like has never been seen before, it says. But so is deliverance and resurrection. Daniel's told there's going to be a time of trouble. And this is something that believers need to remember. Again, we don't live in fear. We don't live under a rock. We don't live ready to build a compound or move up north or something like that. We live, though, understanding that trouble will come. Others have lived through trials and troubles, the likes we will never see. And we cannot live life thinking that our faith will never bring us into a time of hardship, because it will. And it may just be social, being ostracized socially, or it might be a trouble at work, or you hit a ceiling because you're a religious nut and you can't get any further. That might happen to you. We need to be prepared for those things. But I love that in the same breath that Daniel's told, listen, trouble's coming, he's also told about deliverance. He's also given the message of resurrection. And deliverance is the promise for this side of life, that evil and evil kingdoms will have their day, but God's people will be delivered. And we see that time and time again in Scripture. Sometimes they're delivered physically, sometimes they aren't, but they're always delivered spiritually. They've always been given to Christ. Christ has them. That deliverance may not come during their lifetime, but Daniel and the people of his time live with hope that deliverance is coming, that they will be freed from these kingdoms. And this is the message that gave them hope during difficult times, to know these kingdoms have a shelf life. And I might not see the end, but my grandson might, my great-grandson might. Someone will. That end is coming. That's the promise for this side of life. But resurrection is the promise that reminds the people once again of eternity. It reminds them of what is coming. That when we close our eyes to this world, it's not the end. That even though our bodies may be falling apart just physically or sometimes because of persecution, all right, that there's this threat physically, but there's a promise of restoration, and resurrection is that ultimate restoration. When God raises us to a new life and a new body that doesn't bear the scars of the past. And this was such a hopeful message for Daniel. It was such a hopeful message for the people of Daniel's time. And it should bring hope for us as well. And it allows God's people to look ahead so that we can live for today. We look ahead knowing that trouble is coming. We look ahead understanding that problems arise. But we also look ahead knowing that there's deliverance and there's resurrection. That there's restoration that comes. And this kind of confidence is what allows us to live in a difficult time. I remember growing up, one of the phrases that my dad would say often is, "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go." Sometimes it was meant as encouragement. I would come home and I was struggling with something and I didn't know where this would head. And he would say, "I'm going to tell you where this is going to go." Other times I had an idea of how life should be, and I would come and tell him that what he was doing was wrong, and he'd say, "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go." And you know what? He was usually right. He's not perfect, obviously. But that phrase, "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go," brought me such confidence in so many difficult times. To know that my Father, who loved me and cared for me, had an idea of where this was headed. How much more to know that our earthly Father in heaven has told us, "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go." I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what you're dealing with. I don't know where you're at in life in many cases, but God does. And what He says is, "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go." Will there be trouble? Yes. Some of you know that. Some of you have experienced trouble and pain because of your faith. Some of you are living through difficult times because of the sin of others and the abuse in your life. Some of you you're breaking down. The diagnoses and all these different things that are coming are negative. Some of you don't know where you're at in your job. You don't know where your career is headed. I don't know what to tell you, but I know what God says. I'm going to tell you how this is going to go. Trouble will come, but there will be deliverance, and there will be restoration. And that's the promise that we have. And to live confidently like this, it helps us to remember what Jesus Christ has done. Because if Jesus Christ hasn't died for us, if He hasn't died and been resurrected, then we don't have that hope. Then someone saying to us, "I'm going to tell you how this is going to go," it doesn't really matter because that person hasn't been faithful. But we believe that Jesus has risen from the dead. We believe that He died on the cross, but didn't stay dead. And this morning, we're going to celebrate that. We're going to remember that because it's that truth that gives us the power we need to live confidently in difficult times. Here at Crosspoint, we invite anyone who embraces the good news of Jesus to participate in this with us. And we do this to remember. We do this to remember what Jesus has done for us that makes deliverance and resurrection possible. And one of the interesting things that in that last passage from Daniel is that when the angel talks about resurrection, he talks about life, but he also talks about judgment. He says some will be raised to life. God's people will be raised to life. But those who reject God, those who hope in things other than Jesus, they will be raised for judgment. And this is why the sacrifice of Jesus is so important. Because without that, we would all be raised for judgment. There could be no life and there could be no hope. And so as we come to this morning, we come to this table, we come to this time of remembrance with a deep sense of gratitude for the salvation that we can have through Christ. And as we prepare to celebrate this morning, I think it's important to take a few moments and contemplate God's plan of redemption for us. His sending of His Son to die for us. And the deliverance that brings. Take a few moments to think about that. Take a few moments to confess the sin that's in your heart even now. And ponder what Jesus has done. So as the servers will come forward, let's take a moment to contemplate the sacrifice of Jesus.